But to be clear, nothing he said so far is intended to refute naturalism, right? Basically, he was just describing it.
Right. We added a little bit more commentary to it.
So he only contrasted here, he tells us, the two competing worldviews and their implications so that we can be clear on what's at stake here and why the existence of God is such a central and defining issue, right? So that's it. One of them, non-moral, non-personal, right? The other is different because of God's existence from a Christian worldview perspective, right?
So with that in mind, let's turn now to consider some of the reasons why the Christian worldview makes far more sense than the naturalist worldview. And he says that he's going to offer 6 different interrelated arguments for the existence of God. So in each case, he'll identify something that we take for granted in our lives and explain why we need God in order to make sense of those things. So we've covered this a little bit before when we've talked about other things like Nancy Pearcey's 5 principles. And so some of these might sound familiar if you've been with us for a while. If not, you can go back and check those out. And we'll see that he adds more and builds upon. So it gets heady, but at the same time, hopefully we'll break it down. That's why you pay us.
So this first section is on existence, right? He calls it God and existence. And he says, here's a truth so obvious that it seems almost perverse, he tells us to mention it. And what is it? Something exists.
Well, right? Someone wrote a book about that and got paid a lot of money.
He says, even if you doubt everything else, you cannot reasonably doubt that you exist, right? Because the very fact of doubting shows that something or someone is doubting, right?
Right.
It harkens back to, I think, therefore I am.
Good old Descartes.
Descartes, yeah, and all that kind of stuff.
Goes in the woods for 3 days in a cabin, thinks about stuff, and then comes out, and there's the modern worldview. Amazing. See, you can do something in 3 days that revolutionizes the world.
That's right. So, but for those who reflect on such matters like, existence and that kind of stuff, the question arises, why?
Sure.
Right? Why does anything exist at all? So that's the issue, right? What accounts for the fact that anything at all exists? Why is it there? Right? And so that's what he wants us to pursue with regard to this issue of existence. All right.
So philosophers have a special term for things that exist but didn't have to exist. So they exist like you and me, but they didn't have to, right? I didn't need to be born in order for the world to continue.
Right.
Probably some people have wished the opposites just so that their lives get better.
Yeah, or the fact is, I'm dependent on something else for my existence. Right?
So for me to exist, my parents needed to exist in order for me to be here.
Right.
So for the things that exist but didn't have to, it's called the word contingent.
Contingent.
So we'll talk about that. So contingent, there's your vocab word. You can write it down, highlight it in your book.
That's right.
So a contingent thing is one that might not have existed, even though it does in fact exist. Its non-existence is logically possible. So I buy a basketball to go play basketball. I need that basketball to exist in order to play basketball, but it doesn't mean that the basketball needs to exist.
Right.
It just.
So it was. I remember getting my first basketball as a kid, and it was contingent on my dad buying it for me. Right. And before he did that, at least in terms of me having one for my own, it didn't exist.
Right. Or it's contingent because in order for it to have not existed, you wouldn't have liked to play basketball in the future.
Well, that's true.
So it needed to be non-contingent there, but it didn't have to. For the world to continue to spin, to exist, you couldn't pluck it out of existence. You could, and it still would work. So any man-made object and all living organisms are contingent.
Right. So cars, planes, trains, whatever.
Butterflies,
right. Anything.
Mosquitoes.
Yeah. So both man-made objects and all living organisms, right, are all contingent. They're dependent on something else for their existence.
Right. The butterfly might create a hurricane when he flaps his wings, but the butterfly didn't have to exist. So the same goes for any physical or natural objects. The cosmos as a whole is an inconceivably large physical thing, and therefore it's a contingent thing.
Right.
So again, this is an idea coming from the Christian worldview, and also kind of the naturalist worldview. So we are leaving out those worldviews that believe that the world and everything in it is just an illusion, and so we interact with an illusion somehow. But again, to think, therefore I am, a little bit harken back to Descartes there, something has to exist in some fashion. And so, that's when we get into matrix type discussions and the like. But we're wanting to talk about just two of them here, a contrast from an opposite worldview of Christianity. So it, again, doesn't cover everything, but this keeps the discussion more narrow.
Right. So we have contingent things, right? Things that are dependent on something else for their existence, right? Oftentimes this, by the way, is contrasted with necessary existence, something that has to exist and is not dependent on anything else for its existence, right? And we're going to, that's what God is all about. But right now, contingent things, right? All right, so now he moves forward with his argument. Any contingent thing needs an explanation for why it exists, since it might not have existed, right? So, if it's dependent on something else for its existence, it might not have existed, so why does it exist, right? What's the explanation for it? That's what he's getting at here. He says that explanation can't come from the thing itself, right? Because, it has to come from outside of the thing if it's dependent on something else for its existence, right? He says it makes no sense to say that something brought itself into existence. Since it would have to exist already in order to do anything at all to bring itself into existence, right? So that you can't, that's kind of, impossible, we might say.
Well, and then there are people like Lawrence Krauss that writes books about how nothing doesn't really mean nothing, and when he says nothing, he does kind of mean nothing, but not always. And so you have the big debate with John Lennox and him, and then you have people that are kind of Krauss apologists who say, well, he's only talking to the layman when he says nothing. He's trying to get to convey that aspect. But, we have these particles that blink into existence out of nothing. So they came into the universe and they created themselves. But again, as we covered with Mitch Stokes, they come into the universe. And so to say that it came from nothing doesn't ring exactly true, because there is a something here already. Yeah. And so, again, you could have the God of the gaps idea, or the atheism of the gaps of, well, we'll explain it someday through naturalist process. But, for them, they kind of need that point in order to explain a non forever universe existing. And how did it come about? Well, it has to create itself. And so this is their kind of one special pleading area where they say something arose from nothing, or you have the small speck that's super dense that has all the matter in it, and it explodes and it creates everything. Right. That's a really dense little point. Yeah, but where did it come from?
But it's still something.
Right. It's still speck, something.
Right? So the existence of every contingent thing has to be explained by some other thing, right? In other words, if its existence is dependent on something else, then that something else is its explanation, right? That other thing must then itself either be contingent or non-contingent. Right?
So if the universe as a whole is contingent, there needs to be an explanation of why it exists. And that explanation cannot come from the universe itself or anything within the universe, right? So the solar system that Earth is in is contingent. And so we couldn't say that the solar system came from the Earth, unless if it spun out of the Earth or something along those lines. So how do we get outside the universe if we're not allowed anything transcending the universe?
Right. So if the universe itself is contingent, then we have to ask the question, basically, what is it dependent on? Right. Kind of thing. Right.
And so turtles all the way down is the answer.